Welcome to Southern Steep, the public health and social justice podcast brought to you by NASDAD, a nonprofit, nonpartisan association mission to end the intersecting epidemics of HIV, viral hepatitis, and related conditions. Much like brewing stronger tea, this platform aims to brew a stronger community by centering community leaders' voices and their innovative work in the Southern United States.
Hi, Isaiah. Happy New Year. How are you?
Happy New Year to you, Nicole. I am great. How are you?
I'm doing really well. This is our first time recording together in season 3. I am just looking forward to, having a good conversation today and extremely looking forward to our discussion with our guest.
You had written into the arc that we had not recorded together in a while, and I don't think I've recorded with anyone in a while, if I'm being honest.
Well, it's the beginning of season 3, so we're just getting started.
Okay.
I'm really looking forward to introducing our guest. Her name is S. Mandisa Moore, and she is the executive director of the Center for HIV Law and Policy, otherwise known as CHILPI, a national research and advocacy organization that fights stigma and discrimination at the intersection of HIV, race, health status, disability, class, sexuality, and gender identity and expression, with a focus on criminal and public health systems. Based in New Orleans, she is a Black feminist attorney, a trained facilitator, and a cultural and political strategist. Before joining CHILPI, Mandisa founded the Moore O'Neill Law Group, LLC, a Black feminist law and policy practice. Her practice focused on HIV decriminalization litigation, education and advocacy, family law litigation, education and advocacy, employment and public accommodations, discrimination, litigation and education, and police accountability, litigation and advocacy. She was also the litigation and policy director at Frontline Legal Services. Mandisa is a founding member of the Louisiana Coalition on Criminalization in Health, and in 2012 received her JD from Louisiana State University Law Center. Mandisa has researched, published, and presented on abolitionist lawyering, reproductive justice in the law, HIV decriminalization, punitive social policies, and state violence. At its core, her legal work is best defined as using a Black feminist and abolitionist framework to craft legal strategies that move us closer to liberation. Welcome, Mandisa.
Hey, y'all. Thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be in this conversation.
We're so happy to have you. And, I love reading people's bios because it just gives folks the flowers that that they deserve, and it's just you wear so many different hats, and one of the hats brought us together a few years back with some grant making work that we were doing, so just moving and grooving, so yeah, very happy to have you on here. Isaiah also has Louisiana ties, so I was really happy to be able to bring y'all together in a way through this podcast, just because, Louisiana representation is here.
Where in Louisiana, Isaiah?
So I was born and raised in Alexandria, and I lived in New Orleans for 3 years. And one of my first questions for you is not even on the prepared list, which is, where do you live?
I live in New Orleans. I live uptown in the 17th Ward, which is very new for me because I'm from downtown. And I'm sure this is probably true other places, but definitely New Orleans, we're very, very small and we're very, very neighborhood based. Mm-hmm. So it's a big deal like to not live downtown because literally that's where my family has lived for centuries.
Yeah, I love it.
With gentrification and Black displacement, that's where me and my spouse we're able to afford to live uptown.
I hear you. So I have not lived in New Orleans since before the storm, which I'm referring to Katrina.
I know.
But when I lived there, I lived at 4th and Britannia. That's where I lived.
Lovely. Beautiful area.
So anyway, welcome.
Thank you. Yeah. I also love that you're from Central Louisiana. As somebody who's from the city, if you can call New Orleans a city, which is arguable, I think that in state advocacy, it's so important that our strategies not just benefit folks in New Orleans and Baton Rouge, like that they have to work for folks in like Alexandria, in Shreveport, and Monroe, in places like that are smaller, because to me, that's actually ground zero in many ways. So I just love like that you're from Alexandria.
Yes, thank you for saying that. So a lot of people who are unfamiliar with Louisiana, they often think about New Orleans, and that's like the picture that pops into their mind when they think about the state. But it's a fairly large state geographically, and all those places that you mentioned are the ones that are usually, or not usually, that are under-resourced. Absolutely. In terms of like any number of ways, particularly when it comes to HIV specific information and resources. And so, yes, that was when I was growing up. There was one community-based organization in Alexandria. It was called CLASS. Is CLASS still there?
I think so. Yeah.
And that was it. And then you had to drive some distance before you found another community-based organization. And we're talking about wide swaths of the state. So yeah, for sure.
Definitely.
Wait, I have one question before we dive into. Did Nicole get your acronym of the organization right? Because when she said it, you kind of giggled.
No, it was funny. I've never heard that. We just say CHLP.
Oh, wow.
But I like CHLP. You know, I'm going to pass it around with my colleagues.
That's so funny.
They say.
That is so funny, because when I've heard of your organization be talked about with acronyms, it's CHLP, not CHLP.
I love that.
Wow. You know, so glad. That's so funny. Okay.
I'm going to pass it along.
You know, maybe it'll stick.
Yeah, I'm with it.
Mandisa, what brought you to this work? What is your why?
What is my why? Well, two things. My father was an immunologist. So he was a pediatric immunologist. So from a very early age, it was normalized, at least in my household, around like what HIV is and what it isn't. Whereas I think like, you know, it's so much misinformation that starts so young that I would say like me and my siblings and cousins, like we're super, you know, privileged, not only in the sense of having a father who's a doctor, which I don't think like we talk about class privilege enough, but in terms of just knowing what it was, in terms of like how it's transmitted, that there's no risk of touching and all those things that I didn't know until I was a little older, like was not common knowledge. You know what I mean? So having that experience of like, oh yes, like I, you know, have, you know, like I have like patients who are living with HIV, and it was normalized, you know, like it was a chronic illness, like so many other things. And then having dear family members in the late 80s, who at some points, like my mom served like as their main caregiver in their, you know, last weeks and months of life. And so I think like having the experience of having children be a part of caregiving, caretaking, it just changed so much in terms of, you know, like those stigmas around like, you know, like it's so weird, like being an attorney and like doing a lot of discrimination, having, you know, some clients whose, you know, parents like would have them eat from separate plates or that sort of thing, having almost an opposite experience very early. I was like, okay, like it's, you know, I can hug my uncle and, you know, I can like sit next to him and watch TV and all these things. And it wasn't. So I think like that foundation, you know, is something that is really important. And for me, who talks a lot about socialization and shifting cultural narratives, it really does start in childhood. Like we often think, oh, well, like, you know, things we do aren't impactful in children, when it's literally the opposite. And so I could see having those foundational moments as a kid. But it was really after Katrina, like when I got involved in some really like Black feminist organizing in the city, like around like intersectional issues such as like the gendered aspect of housing accessibility, like the gendered racialized aspect of healthcare access, where that's when I got a harm reduction lens and analysis that really anchored my HIV work. So it was funny, as a kid, it was more like a medical, here, like, it's no problem, it's no stigma in that way. But it wasn't until I got older and was doing like some like radical organizing, like I saw like the like socio political side of HIV stigma, if that makes sense. So I think like having that experience as a kid made it easy to be like, oh, I get this. I know how it's transmitted. I know how it's not transmitted. But I had the like harm reduction lens that I think really grounded it for me. And so I think of like learning HIV work through a reproductive justice lens was so critical, in terms of like Black women and femmes doing work in a space where it was constantly having to render ourselves and our experiences visible in a time where, much like our Black feminist elders said, all the Blacks are men and all the women are white, but some of us are brave. Like that wasn't just the 60s or 70s. It was very much 2005 and beyond. And so like that really anchored, and I would say started like the path as to how I ended up here, of like using this lens to like do work that's important, but in a way that actually centers people who are at the margins, not by choice, but because of conditions.
Thanks for taking us on such a journey. And it really helped paint a picture, with your, foundation and core values, but also just seeing the transformation. We're seeing like, there are different levels of stigma. There's that interpersonal level, and then there's the societal system level. And, really seeing that from all aspects of your experience that you shared. Thank you for sharing all of that. You recently became executive director of CHLP, or CHLP. CHLP, y'all are national. Mm-hmm. You're based in New Orleans. Mm-hmm. What work is CHLP doing currently that's like more centered in the South?
Yeah, so that was one of the things that actually really excited me and attracted me to taking on this like leadership in this national org. Because CHLP has been a national org since its inception, but has been based in New York. And as we know, oftentimes with national groups, especially ones based in the coast, it's still ways in which that coastal lens anchors the work. And so for me, again, I just feel very blessed to have learned from so many just really cool Southern organizers who really anchored me in the understanding that as goes the South, as goes the nation. And so that's one of the things that I'm super excited about. Like sometimes I don't focus on this, but it's a really big deal to have a Southerner lead a national organization, so just like the lens that I'm excited to bring. So for example, like a huge part of the work that we do is supporting state coalitions, organizing and working to work on their, state HIV laws, whether that's HIV specific criminal laws or general intent laws that are used to really target people with HIV and other stigmatized health conditions. And it's no surprise that a lot of the states that we are currently supporting are in the South. So for me, it's important that we be explicit about that, and that we reclaim words like Southern strategy, which I think historically have been used to be like anti-Black, anti-trans, anti-queer in terms of in terms of the right, using that to really push back civil rights legislation. I want to use that language not in support of that, but in support of a strategy like that, centering work that we're already doing and magnifying it in a way that, actually, as opposed to trying to make what worked in California and New York work here, what if we use the strategies that work here as examples as to how to organize in other places? It's shifting the framework. So I'm super stoked about that possibility. I also think that, it's a certain way that we move. And one of the things that, for me as a deep Southerner, the focus on on relationship building, and like not moving as fast as the relationships can hold, which which often runs counter to a lot of deliverables that we get from funders and lots of these arbitrary ways that often make us move faster than we actually have the capacity to move. So as a deep Southerner who sees the importance, who knows the importance of long-term strategies, I'm also excited to bring that into the work. And it's interesting, I can't count the number of people who are like, oh, so are you moving to New York? And it's like, no, I'm not. If anything, CHLP will move here, but never. You know what I mean? And that's not about, I don't want to move, though I would never move to this place that expensive. Why would I do that? It's more about shifting the lens and the value.
Yeah, totally. 100%. So thank you for sharing that. I think that that's such an important kind of reset about why we do the work that we do and where we do the work that we do it, and being intentional about not only the people that are doing that work, but where that work is done. And so, we're very privileged to be a capacity building assistance provider and a technical assistance provider for community-based organizations in the South, particularly those that are doing HIV prevention work. What would you say would be the top line ways that you kind of partner with, work with community-based organizations?
So one of the things that is really important in CHLP is not going where we haven't been invited, which to me as a Southerner, particularly post-Katrina, who saw the opposite, so many people ate off of us, literally. And that reckoning has not happened, and it probably never will, even though it needs to. And there's so many reckonings that need to happen. That's not the only one. But that experience of folks, of disaster capitalism that we as progressives also participated in really anchors so much of how, I'm excited to join an organization that already has this understanding. So starting there of being clear that, yes, we are experts and so are you. And so being very clear, this is an exchange, and I think that's hard for lawyers because we're conditioned and society really enables us to think that we're the shit. And so coming in very clear with here's what I'm bringing, here's what you're bringing. And there's no hierarchy in terms of I know and you must listen. And so being very clear that starting with we're invited, and also just starting with an assessment of what is happening. So I'll give an example of a state that I consider the South. Some people would say it's the Midwest. They have been wanting to organize around starting a coalition to address, the criminal laws in their state. Reached out to us. Our first meeting was not, ooh, here's what we can do, da-da-da-da. I was like, what are y'all looking for? What are the conditions that made y'all want to organize a coalition? And then after we had a sense of that, then, well, here's some ways that we can suggest. We do research. We have a source book in which we look at every state and what's happening. Let's share that. Does this track with what y'all are experiencing on the ground? What needs to be added? Is it helpful? How can we make it more helpful? Some states, sometimes it's making palm cards that are shareable with, people in the legislature, or, in other states, it's a fact sheet. But being clear, here's what we can offer, what's useful. I think that requires listening. I think it requires an accurate assessment of your skills and capacity. I think it's also one of those things where being a national organization, sometimes we have connections and partnerships that folks in states or locales don't have. So how do we use that to be oh, this national group is looking for XYZ? Well, actually, we could apply for this grant, but this local group should actually apply. Oh, you don't fund or work with groups with a small budget? Oh, well, let's partner. We have a budget that meets this. Well, let's partner. So how do we use what we have in ways that are uplifting, work on the ground, and also pushing back on them of okay, well, why do you have this requirement? Is there any flexibility? because you want groups on the ground, but you have these requirements that make it hard for groups on the ground to participate. So also using our ability to like push back on them and be like, I think you need to change your requirements because like you're not finding the groups who you say that you're wanting to find. That could be because of your requirements, so like and I think that's what it means to, have power. Like I get concerned with how we as a movement talk about language in terms of we want power. Power is the ability to move and change things. I think what we mean is we don't want people who are unaccountable in their power holding.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's some differences, right? Like we don't want people who hoard power at the expense of others. So how do we use the power that we have in ways that are expanding and not restricting?
Yeah, like power with instead of power over. And I think that sometimes that could be a fine balance for folks. And yeah, it is something to be conscious of constantly.
I appreciate the way you answered the question because, about the partnership and not coming in as the expert, because you're in a profession that is most often dramatized. And by that, I mean, people watch Law and Order and they feel like, okay, so now I know something. Let me go out here and start talking. I just feel like that happens a lot with lawyers because, everyone watches TV. No one feels like they can tell me and Nicole anything about facilitating trainings because that's not a thing. No one watches it on TV. But for some reason, people watch Law and Order and they feel like they know the law.
And it goes to our heads and we think that we know more than we do, which is why I think it's important for us to always be in accountable relationships to check ourselves.
One of the questions I wanted to ask you, and I'm going to ask this broadly, and then you can answer it however you want to answer it. How would you just define the state of HIV criminalization in the South right now? Like if you had to just give like a top line assessment of where we are, how would you define it?
Absolutely. Top line assessment of HIV criminalization in the South is we cannot move HIV criminalization outside of the framework of legacies of enslavement. Like it perplexes me when we as a movement try to talk about criminalization of abortion, criminalization of marijuana, criminalization of public dissent, of any criminalization as if Black people are not targeted explicitly by criminalization. And that's also true of HIV criminalization, right? It's like this idea that like Black people are targeted and then there's HIV criminalization as if the data isn't showing what we anecdotally already know. If you are Black living with HIV, that's not making you criminalized. It's adding to ways you are already criminalized. And the non-Black people who are criminalized because of their status are criminalized by the very virtue of their proximity or perceived proximity to Blackness. So even if you're not Black, it is still an anti-Black issue that you are criminalized because of. And so the fact that like that's not central to our analysis is a part of what I think is HIV criminalization in the South. Is like a deep understanding of the legacies of white supremacy that like permeate this entire country and have particular strongholds in this region still. And so like that to me is the top line and it plays out. So I know Williams Institute just dropped some data at the end of last year. 91% of cases in Louisiana are Black men, of folks criminalized under the intentional exposure to HIV statute. Yet there are people still having race-neutral conversations. Unacceptable. So like that, I feel like is general. Then even within that, like even within Black, which of course is not a monolith, we also can't act like of those 91% of Black men who are targeted, they're working class. You know what I mean? Like they're folks who are not like the lawyers and judges of the state of Louisiana. So we can't act like class, like we can't act like gender expression, because I know that of the Black men, I know a lot of them are trans women who've been counted, unfortunately and incorrectly, as Black men. So we can't act like even within this group, there aren't especially marginalized people because their gender expression, their class status, their immigration background, their education, that really are targeted in particular ways. And so, yeah, like I think that is true, like not just in Louisiana. I know that there's some data in Tennessee and Georgia and Florida that shows this exact same thing. And that data tracks with what we know about criminalization in general. It's not like there's any aspect of criminalization in which Black people are not targeted.
Yeah, 100%. And I'm reminded of, when HIV really began to take off in the 80s and early 90s, it would have been malpractice to talk about HIV and not talk about gay men, for example. And as you're talking, I'm reminded of that. I'm like, you can't really, at that time, and even now to a degree, you can't talk about HIV and not talk about gay men. So I think what I'm hearing you say is, what my takeaway from that is that you can't talk about HIV criminalization and not talk about racism and anti-Blackness and all of those things, because they kind of, it's a part of the same conversation. That was my takeaway from your brilliance.
Thank you. That's exactly what, like, that's a takeaway I'm hoping to portray. So yes. And I think that we as a movement, have to move away from the politics of comfortability and into a politic of discomfortability, not because it feels good to be uncomfortable, but we have to be able to interrogate questions such as, okay, we've been doing these same strategies, we've been doing these same ways of being. Has it resulted in material condition, like in a shift in material conditions for people living with HIV? Has it resulted in lower transmissions? Has it resulted in any of those things? And not because it's about pointing fingers or blame, but if it's really about ending the epidemic, we have to be willing to think outside the box and locate ourselves as we talk about problems. Again, I'm an abolitionist. So when I'm talking about this, I'm also talking about how we even address criminalization as something that like only cops are involved in, as if we can't name social workers who call the cops on their clients, as if we can't name case managers who call the cops on their clients or who police their clients in these like very concrete ways, which mirror the policing that law enforcement does. And so to me, like a part of addressing criminalization is not seeing it as something that they do, that the cops do, that the prosecutors do, but acknowledging, even if we aren't law enforcement, what are the ways that we buy into this framework that some people are deserving and some people are not. We see it when we see it like when like a cop kills a Black person. Oh, well, he was a dad. Okay. And if he wasn't a dad, he still shouldn't have been killed. Or, oh, well, he was a law school grad. I don't care if he sold crack on the street. It does not give him the right. Like, how do we buy into like respectability, right? Of like, he deserves to be lived, as if we don't all deserve to live. And like we internalize that in the HIV world in terms of, oh, this person wasn't a sex worker, wasn't a monogamous relationship, was not it doesn't matter. No one should be criminalized. You know what I mean? And so like that's, I think, the questions that I don't think ultimately are harder, even if they feel harder to engage and to have with our people.
I don't really have anything else to add. Like, and on like that's end of story, period, at the end. I mean, honestly, you're absolutely right. Like, I got a similar takeaway from what Isaiah got, but at the end of the day, like, respectability politics comes up so much, and no one deserves to be criminalized. No one deserves to die. For the South, like, I lived in Florida for a really long time, and Florida had such a hard time getting legislation even in discussion. There's a coalition there, a pretty strong coalition. And, for some states, are there some Southern states that are just now beginning to talk about coalition building? Like, where are different states at in that coalition realm?
So Oklahoma, which I consider the South, that's the state like that I was like, to me, it's the South, and it's weird when folks are like, it's not, but we all have our own, like there are border states. Like I think people say South and often mean the deep South, which are different things, right? Like the South is not a monolith. There's Texas, which is simultaneously the Deep South, the Midwest, and also like the Southwest. There's Florida, which, you know, has Miami, Central Florida, and the Panhandle. You have the Gulf Coast, you have the Deep South, you have the Appalachian. You know what I mean? It's different. So I hear that like Oklahoma is not the Deep South, but it's still the South. Long story short, I'm excited about like work that advocates are starting in Oklahoma. I'm excited. I know Georgia had a modernization effort in the last year, and I'm curious to see like, you know, what is the follow-up work? You know, as far as like the coalition, I think took a break and is starting back in January. Of course, I have to shout out what's happening in Louisiana. I'm the co-founder with many other people like Robert Suttle, Julie Fitch, folks at Women with the Vision, of the coalition there. And we have been doing some dope work. When I started at CHFP, I haven't been involved because my role changed, but I know the folks are holding it down still. That's exciting. Tennessee, you know, has so much happening there. Like just as an example, I know folks in Mississippi, you know, are moving, you know, especially like around like addressing the ways that folks who are already incarcerated are being targeted and getting enhanced sentences. So I love this framework of starting with those who are especially marginalized, as opposed to what we often see of like what feels easy, and then kind of using the "we'll come back" framework, which historically has not actually worked. So I like what Mississippi seems to be flipping that. So yeah, like those are just like some top level that come to mind of what excites me about the region, you know, and work that's happening.
You know, you just listed so many great efforts, and we have conversations all the time about what's considered the South. Right. I would consider Oklahoma the South. Mm-hmm. Some people get really tight, like panties in a bunch about Maryland being in the South.
Harriet Tubman was from Maryland, so it'd be hard not to consider that the South.
Maryland is below the Mason-Dixon line.
No, they don't consider themselves the South, and that's the problem.
Well, they're wrong. But here's what I want to ask you. Is Nicole's from Florida? Is she a Southern?
Yeah.
Okay. So here's what I would say. I would agree as well. But South Florida, which is where I was born, is much more, it's considered like the more north of Florida you go, the more south you get. The South is not a monolith.
Yeah. Politically, Florida is definitely the South.
You know, she's getting redder and redder.
Redder. Same with Louisiana.
There's a lot happening. The South is ever in shift, but I'm feeling very hopeful about the work that you all are doing and the efforts that you all are making consciously to center the South. I feel, you know, as far as national organizations go, you're right that a lot of them do happen to be on the coast or based there. And I think that this is a really exciting shakeup to what national orgs could or should look like.
I agree.
So I have questions for you that we ask all of our guests. What do you love about the South? And what do you want to see for the South?
So what I love about the South is I've traveled pretty extensively across this region. All those stereotypes, which are grounded in truth and are also much more complex. I've traveled extensively across the South, and there's never a time where I have not seen a Black person. And what I love about that is what also confuses me about the rest of the country. Because I'm a Southerner, because Black people are literally even if it's 5 of us in one home, like we're there in that most rural place, I forget that there are places in the country that don't have that. You know, so like for me, like the way like that we center Blackness in a particular way, like it took me a while to understand that a lot of what people love about the South or hate about the South or are indifferent about is actually Black culture. Like Black Eyed Peas and greens on New Year's is a Southern tradition because it is a West African tradition that is just so prevalent in this region. You know, it is so many things like that. I also love our history of resistance that, you know, is often invisibilized, erased, that, isn't often like talked about, all of those things. And it just is. And like, to me, those kind of stories couldn't have happened outside of this region, and could only have happened in rural areas where the thought of calling the cops for help was never an option. And the need to like protect yourself and to be like your own safety communities was a necessity all of the time. And so like, those are the stories of the South that I love, are histories of resistance. And last, I love how we value the presence of being, like how it really is important of the relationships that we have, not so much who you are, but what's the connections that you have to people. Like, it perplexes me when folks try to have a community meeting and not have food. You're trying to talk to me about tenants' rights and you want to have water and some dry cookies. No, baby, I need red beans. You know what I mean? I need some baked chicken, a salad, a pound cake, because we're exchanging something here. And you think that it's going to be a one way? I've worked all day and you're asking me to attend a meeting and there won't be food? Like, there won't be a way to break bread? That's the trust that I don't have in you. Because if you don't know how integral food is to my culture, I don't think that you're going to know what the needs are that we're trying to address either, because that's a basic one that you just skipped. So I love that about us. Second part of your question was, what is the hope that I have?
What are you looking for in the South? Like, what do you want to see for the South?
What do I want to see? I want to see us be able to remain here. I think something that I was reading, this article that was really powerful and very hard to read. And it was talking about how, like, as people are being, priced out and really pushed out of like places in the Northeast and the West Coast, they're coming here. And for, some folks, they don't have histories that have ever been in the South. And for other people, like namely Black people whose ancestors left in the Great Migration, it is a return of sorts. And the part that is challenging is folks are being pushed out of their cities and are contributing to us being pushed out, contributing to like our displacement and gentrification. So what I want to see is us be able to remain in our ancestors' lands, and what does that mean to remain? Like, what is that? What is the infrastructure needed for us to remain? Housing, public works, education, healthcare, all of those things. So those are the things that I look forward to, like, like that I want. I also want us to see our value, and see our value as the region that we are, not in terms of, oh, well, we're great, because we have industries that mimic other places. No, like, our value exists outside of how similar we are to like mainstream or like the Northeast or the West Coast. So I want us to see value in ourselves, and to also trust our trust like the people who came before us. Like, sometimes I get very sad at the ways like that I see my peers, like, my colleagues talk about our elders' movements, like the civil rights movement or voting rights movement, in these ways that, I was talking to someone, I was like, look, those people, a lot of them are still alive. We could read a book or we could just ask them, like we can actually just ask them, what was their experience? What was it like having to shift strategies? Like, what was it like having to have conflict in these moments? Like when dogs are chasing you and those sort of things. And I just want us to like have more of that, just sense of value of us. So.
Mm-hmm. Your website is hivlawandpolicy.org. Is there any other place you would want to direct folks, any other socials that you wanted to make sure that the listeners have?
So our socials are all the same. IG, Twitter, Facebook, HIV law and policy. One of the things I guess that is exciting about somebody like me, like, who's on social media lives, I'm excited for us like increase our social media presence. So shout out to the CHOP team, Dee Resnick, our comms person, who really is increasing our footprint in that way, because it's people who I think we have the chance to engage online who we haven't been able to engage so far. Shout out to like the rest of the team, Jada, Amir, Kay, Steven, Matt, and our founder as well, who is a super helpful resource and expert, Catherine. So just shout out to the team. But yeah, like I think like what's cool is HIV law and policy across the board.
Well, Mandisa, it's been great to meet you and to chat with you. I am always thrilled to meet a fellow Louisianian. So that's always great. And I appreciate all of the wisdom and that you've shared today, and also all of the work that you're doing and that you're continuing to do. So thank you so much for both coming on and for both sharing so much with Nicole and I.
Thank you for having me, Isaiah. It's an honor to meet you. I love meeting a Louisianan. Nicole, it is great to see you again. And it feels honored to have been asked, and I look forward to being in community moving forward.
Yeah, we are going to continue to be in touch and looking forward to continuing this great relationship. So thank you so much for joining us, and we hope that you have a really magical rest of your day. Wow, what an amazing conversation. I am really glad that we were able to share space with her today.
Absolutely. It is a unique conversation in so many ways, one that I feel like we don't have often enough, and one that, frankly, Nicole, folks who do HIV prevention workers sometimes feel like they don't have the space to have, just because it's not passing out condoms or getting people to swallow PrEP. I feel like a lot of the things that she said are so central to this work, yet rarely is this the topic of conversation. That's an I statement.
And I'm really looking forward to our listeners getting a chance to hear this episode, because I think some of what Mandisa shared is just it resonates so hard. What she was saying about what she wants to see for the South, that really hit for me for multiple ways. The gentrification piece that she mentioned, but also just the realities of climate and shorelines getting washed away. Like, there are just so many things that are impacting the South and our abilities to stay here. So now I'm going to take us to a segment that we call the Southern Charm. And here we highlight the work of someone or an organization that is charmingly impacting the South. On today's episode, we're keeping it in New Orleans, and we're highlighting Title NOLA. Title, Transgender Inclusive Development, Advocacy, and Learning, is based in New Orleans, and they are a trans-led collective of community members, healthcare providers, students, and educators in the Gulf South, united in their commitment to trans liberation through equitable healthcare and healing. They believe that trans and gender expansive communities are experts regarding their own healthcare needs and experiences, and they envision a future where healthcare organizations and providers consider trans health equity to be necessary, intersectional, community-led, systemic, and ongoing. I chose Title because, one, we love a good theme of New Orleans and being more centered in Louisiana. But two, I really liked how Title is prioritizing the voices and centering trans individuals with this work. And the different capacity building efforts that they are having in their state. So wanted to they're a Southern charm today.
Yeah, we're all about that here. We've had trans voices on this podcast. We will continue to do so. We will continue to lift up trans-led organizations that are doing this type of work in the South. And if you are doing HIV prevention work for trans individuals, or if you would like to be featured in either Southern Charm or on this show, reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you.
Absolutely. Well, Isaiah, it's been a pleasure getting to see you as always. Loved, having an opportunity to be on this podcast episode together. And I'm so glad that I was able to connect you with Mandisa. It's been a pleasure.
You're welcome. And I'm adding her to my list of experts and people that can offer wisdom whenever I'm looking for someone in the South to do so. So thank you, Nicole, for introducing me to yet another fabulous person. And thanks to you too for being fabulous. Why not? And you're a true Southerner from Florida.
From a true Southerner to another true Southerner, thank you for being you. And, I hope all of you have a great rest of your day.
I'm Isaiah Webster.
I'm Nicole Elenoff. Thanks for listening.